Um, as you know, and as was discussed in the last panel, the first 2 billion people came online in the last more or less 25 years. In a very rapid way, the next 5 billion are going to come online. And they're not going to come online with desktop computers and laptop computers. They're going to come online with smartphones. And this radical connectivity is going to profoundly impact the way international affairs is conducted. But at the same time, the basics of foreign policy for countries, I expect, will remain the same. So you've been in this job as foreign minister for the past 2 years. And I'm curious how you approach your job, what your core interests are as foreign minister in this digital age.
Well, I think the role the Prime Minister gave me is to do two things. One, to promote Canadian values, and two, to promote Canadian interests. And I think where it becomes interesting is where those two issues intersect. Obviously, there are many areas of the world where you can go, where you can speak openly, and you can speak, freely and truthfully. In other areas of the country, in other areas of the world, you can't. And increasingly, we see a presence online. And so, while it's a challenge not to be able to speak in person to the Iranian people, it's also an opportunity to use new technologies, to speak in political forums, online, and to be able to reach people in different ways, but sometimes every bit as effective, or even more effective than you might have been able to do the conventional way that we conducted diplomacy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you have been a forceful proponent of freedom in countries like Iran, where this type of repression exists. And countries like Canada are increasingly noting the importance of the fact that people are accessing their human and political rights through the internet. And so I was pleased to see and wanted to congratulate you on the sanctions that you introduced yesterday, in which you created a carve-out for software and hardware devices that are critical for people accessing their rights online and through these new technologies. I'll note that the United States just announced about an hour ago similar carve-outs. So you guys beat them to the punch. Congratulations. You've also been recently have been praised for the way in which you're reaching out directly to Iranians, for example. And so we're going to, I'd like to come to that initiative in a second. But related to the sanctions, how do you balance creating those stiff economic sanctions with creating these carve-outs for new technologies to empower average citizens to access information and publish it securely?
Well, in many respects, the biggest threat to the regime in Iran, for example, and there, I could say literally a few dozen countries, their biggest threat to the stability of the regime is information. And Iran has been notorious in monitoring and filtering and restricting that information. So what we did yesterday is we changed our approach on sanctions. Rather than saying, here are the things we're restricting, we're saying everything is restricted, and then we're doing carve-outs for things that aren't. And obviously anything that we can do that allows us to break the iron curtain of information and to be able to, to get around state restrictions is obviously a good thing. And the department, the government, others have done a lot to try to supply people with ways around these type of filters to evade the restrictions so that we can speak directly to the Iranian people, particularly in the run-up to their elections on June the 14th. I mean, already we see, they're not going to be free and fair. I mean, for example, the most basic thing, 51% of the population are not allowed or disqualified from even standing for president. So we've used different tactics to be able to speak to different people, and I think it's been the early reviews are successful, but we're still really in the infancy of this, and we're pleased the Obama administration is watching so closely what we're doing here in Ottawa, and the quick turnaround time to match our.
Yeah, well, I have to say, and I'm sure your staff is
Scotty's
also,
laughing.
that have already told you this, but since that announcement just one day ago, my email has just been, inbox has been populated with Iranians from inside the country and activists and others just saying this is creating huge new opportunities for them to access this information. So again, I just want to congratulate you for that. Now, I guess it was a couple weeks ago that you engaged in a new experiment in launching what has been called a global dialogue. And the global dialogue was really targeted at Iranians both inside and outside the country. And I was wondering if you could describe these recent efforts to reach out to Iranians, what you learned from the experience.
Well, the global dialogue we did in conjunction with the Monk Center at the University of Toronto through the efforts of some really amazing people at DFATE. We were able to have virtually a cyber conference, a conversation that we were able to assist people in Iran through various circumvention technology. We believe up to 360,000 people were able to either watch or see and learn from it since then. So it's a pretty amazing opportunity to be able to speak to that large of a crowd. I mean, I saw Tom Clark just spoke here. I mean, it's really easy in Canada. He can go on his TV show on Sunday mornings and get 360,000 people. Obviously, it's tremendously hard for those of us to challenge the regime with an alternative viewpoint and provide a democratic space for political debate. So the early reviews on it from our officials are pretty positive, and we're pretty excited about it. At the same point in time, we've got to be realistic. I mean, this is not going to replace what the country really needs, but we hope that it will inject an opportunity and a political space for people to engage. I mean, we're seeing increasingly, President Obama was in Berlin 5 years ago, in the summer when he was running for president the first time as a U.S. senator, and he spoke to hundreds of thousands of people in Berlin. This is a very different obviously, scenario where 300,000 people couldn't actually gather in a public space, but behind closed doors, we're trying to create some space for that type of debate. I hope this is really in the infancy, that this digital diplomacy will be able to grow by leaps and bounds. We have to find a different way, though. We closed our mission in Tehran, and we'd lack the capacity to be able to have any engagement with the Iranian people. And it's a great way of underlining, reminding that we have no issue with the people of Iran. It's rather with their senior leadership who we have an issue with.
Yeah, it was. I saw the statistics and was blown away by them. 360,000 people connecting to the global dialogue from inside Iran. I mean, there were lots of people who were connecting from other parts of the world, but 360,000 people from inside Iran. And thinking about the obstacles that they had to overcome to get online is pretty remarkable, given those obstacles. So, do you think this is the future of diplomacy? Going not necessarily around governments, but using these new technology to go directly to the people?
Well, if the biggest threat to the regime is information that will facilitate a challenge function, then I think this is going to play an increasingly bigger role in diplomacy. I mean, obviously, yesterday we announced things like circumvention technology we would not have sanctions on. At the same time, the sanctions, we've been, they were very effective in Burma. They've been very effective. They were very effective, I believe, in South Africa with apartheid. They've proven to be ineffective at this stage with the supreme leader and those close to him. So this is just another tool in our arsenal, and the capacity to have a different voice, the Canadian voice, and others at that conference at the University of Toronto, hopefully will fill in a democratic void in that country.
Well, it's off to a remarkable start. Again, just a couple weeks ago, this happens. There wasn't a whole lot of advertising about it because for fear that perhaps the regime would try to block it in some way, and yet it had a remarkable success in creating this opening for conversation and dialogue. The question is, where does direct diplomacy go from here? I mean, is this a concept that you would like Canada to advance in other places, or and what is Canada's role in taking this concept of direct diplomacy forward?
I don't think we can say where it's going to go, only that the sky's the limit. Mayor Scott was speaking about having 2 or 3 computers in your office. I can remember about 20 years ago at this very time, being a young 24-year-old assistant to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or at that time it was called the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. And I thought this ridiculous idea of, I sent the first email I ever sent was in the minister's office. And I thought this was absolutely ridiculous, because why would you bother sending a message from a computer to someone who was on the same floor? You know, for the love of God, why wouldn't you just get up and go talk to them? And, you know, in the course of me sitting here, I've probably gotten, you know, 20 emails on my BlackBerry. So I think we don't know where this is going, only to know that the political space in the cloud can be incredibly powerful. I think if you look at the role that new media technologies played in the Arab Spring, or the Arab seasons, depending on how you want to call it, it certainly had a tremendous opportunity. Obviously, that facilitated demonstrations, brought together like-minded activists who were fighting against corruption, who were fighting against cronyism, and fighting against the privilege that political elites had. It's very different in Iran. It's very different in other parts of the world where people don't have that capacity. So you understand why regimes fear losing control of information. And I think the sky's the limit. I think we're doing a small bit with the Canadian government and foreign affairs, and we've got to look at what other freedom activists are doing, and how do we collaborate and work together. Part of it is the technology, and the circumvention technology is growing by leaps and bounds every month. And of course, the different spaces in the cloud are opening up, and we're very excited about it. This is just another instrument to promote our values and to try to, in the case of Iran, to give democratic space that the regime won't allow them to have.
As more and more people come online and are accessing their human and political rights through the internet, there's been a greater, more consistent call for internet freedom more generally. And you also hear of this growing dichotomy between open and closed societies. And I was wondering if you could speak on a bit about this. Like, what do closed societies both lose and gain by limiting the access that their citizens have to the internet?
Well, this is an area where Canada is standing at the forefront internationally. We do not want to see in any way, shape, or form, you know, state regulation of the internet, state regulation of the cloud. You know, the countries that want to do that, you know, people very quickly ascribe motive to them, and this, you know, represents the biggest threat to tyrannical regimes, and represents one of the biggest hopes for freedom. I mean, if you look at the civil war and the conflict in Syria, in 1982, when the former president, the late President Assad, you know, 20,000 people were killed, a good chunk of them around Homs, but there was barely a few pictures that ever got out, let alone people who were able to stream live video to CNN or to the BBC. And, you know, that's a pretty rudimentary technology compared to what we're doing in Iran right now, but it's allowing those voices and the victims, their face, to be seen by the world. In the case of Syria, it hasn't brought an end to the conflict any sooner, but I think if you looked at other of the conflicts in North Africa, it probably played a pretty big role. The regime couldn't hide what was going on. They couldn't act with impunity, because the world would literally, quite literally be watching.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and you've seen it, as you mentioned, in the Arab awakening. You've seen it in Syria. You've seen it in other parts of the world as well. As people come online, the transparency that they gain and the accountability that the international community and others can bring to many of these regimes becomes a lot easier because you're collaborating with people inside the countries. And you've given a couple of examples, but in the immediate future, how do you see these connective technologies helping to open these societies in a way that doesn't lead to instability, but leads to greater openness and perhaps reform and incremental change that brings a greater, deeper stability to these places?
Well, I think it has a great capacity to lead to instability, and I don't think in all cases instability is a bad thing. I mean, the government in Egypt, the government of Hosni Mubarak, became very unstable, and we shouldn't worship at the altar of stability and stability at all costs. I mean, I think a better future awaits people when they're with freedom, and the cloud, these new technologies, equip them to obtain that freedom. And no longer can the veil of secrecy no longer can you put a blockade on information. And I think in the end, it's going to be harder and harder for tyrannical regimes to avoid the stories getting out and avoid the truth getting in.
I really...
And accountability.
Yeah.
Accountability for regimes on that is limitless. And just because we've seen a long war in Syria doesn't discount the great potential.
I really appreciate your comment. It brings to mind my former boss's, Condoleezza Rice's, I think, very thoughtful statement that for 60 years the United States and others pursued stability in the Arab world at the expense of liberty and ended up achieving neither. So I think that holds true today as it did 6 years ago when she said it.
And these new technologies are a more modern, interactive platform than Voice of America, than the BBC World Service. I mean, one of the biggest tools for the dissemination of information is the Persian service of the BBC. This is just another level of that actually creates a space for people, a political space for people in the cloud.
And echo chambers, which are really important. Now, of course, with all these people, all these folks coming online, there are going to be security challenges for individuals, for corporations, and even for states. So what role do you see the United States and Canada playing in preparing themselves in the world for these sorts of challenges?
I think cybersecurity is increasingly, you can see major American political actors, the intelligence committee, the intelligence community, and others that talk about cybersecurity becoming one of the most paramount threats to national security. And that's not just with intellectual property, it's not just with military information, basic infrastructure, let alone privacy, which is, I think, for most people, one of their greatest security threats. So I think we've got to work with like-mindeds against I'll just say charitably, against those who are not like-minded. And I think we know who they are.
Or like-minded in a very bad way. So at the same time, Canada has been a very strong voice at the UN and other fora on internet freedom. Are there areas that you think that, in terms of Canadian leadership, there could be more of in this area, in this space?
I think we've got to not only tackle the challenge of cybersecurity threats, we've also got to remain resolute in attempts by some to regulate, either formally or informally, against the challenges that Google or BlackBerry, others have had in certain parts of the world, where the regime wants the control, where the internet and the cloud and digital diplomacies. These are things all about the government not having control, which we think is a pretty good thing.
Well, recently, our executive chairman, Eric Schmidt, and my director, Jared Cohen, have co-authored a book called The New Digital Age. And in that book, they cover a lot of the same topics that we've been discussing here. And on balance, they believe that as the next 5 billion come online, it's going to be a really exciting, prosperous, important time for people in those societies who are going to be coming online, accessing new tools, education, et cetera. But they are not tech utopians either. They see that there is a challenge since a lot of these places where people are going to come online don't have the same sorts of institutions, rule of law, et cetera, to help smooth this transition in this digital revolution that we're experiencing. We have to remain vigilant. We can't be passive. So I'm curious from your perspective, how optimistic should we be about the role these technologies have in taking forward the countries in the region that we've been talking about?
Yeah, the sky's the limit. We were in rural East Africa 2 weeks ago, and you literally saw people emerging, literally, from mud huts with grass roofs, with digital phones. In rural Africa, in rural East Africa, one of the greatest payment options, are people paying, if they're buying a Coca-Cola, is to pay for with their cell phone.
Right.
Which brings me to the issue is how people coming out of a rural, in a rural community, out of a mud hut with grass roof, with the GDP per capita in Tanzania, for example, is $580, $590 per person. How these people can afford cell phones, and why do we pay so much for cellular service in Canada?
Absolutely. I want to echo, I just came from...
There's another freedom issue.
Yes, that's right. I just came from Burma, where I was equally surprised. Like, here's a place that had very little internet access, where SIM cards in the country up until about 3 months ago cost $2,500 to get a SIM card, where cellular technology and access to phones was almost impossible to find. And now, just a very short period of time later, you go there, and even though people still don't have those cards, they all have smartphones that aren't connected to the internet, aren't connected to cellular networks, but they're still using them to exchange information, to pass information from person to person, from village to city and city to village. So the revolution in this sense is coming. I wanted to, just in closing, ask if you have any particular projects or additional ideas in this space that you believe that we should be aware of or can collaborate with.
I think what we want to do is identify where should we be first movers, where should we promote freedom in the spaces where we're most concerned about. Obviously, Iran would constitute that. That's why we're doing a lot. We want to do more. We got to realize this is not going to change things overnight. The Cold War wasn't won in a few weeks or a few months. But I think the more we promote freedom and give people the capacity to get alternative information, create a democratic space, that's what digital diplomacy is all about. And I think we're very much in the infancy. How do we use new and emerging technologies, adapt them, and deploy them as quickly as possible? I don't see this replacing conventional diplomacy, but I think it can complement it in a big way, particularly in those areas where the conventional option isn't an option.
Well, Mr. Minister, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I imagine that when Google invited you to a fireside chat, you didn't actually think there'd be the heat from a fire being cast at us. But thank you for your patience in the heat and for your time with us here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.